Greetings, young students. Yes, it's true. It's me, Miss Jean, here once again. This week, I thought that we would look at squirrels. Because if there's one animal that I think, no matter where you are in the city, you're probably going to see at least one, it's going to be a squirrel. And it turns out squirrels are pretty interesting. They're related to some pretty interesting other species of animals. You can get flying squirrels, ground squirrels, regular squirrels. We don't have any flying squirrels in California, I don't think. Definitely on the East Coast, apparently, they're pretty common. Ground squirrels, I've seen a lot of those up around Yosemite, but I don't usually see them around here. But squirrels are actually an interesting animal because they've really figured out how to live amongst people. They find any old tree, they can figure out how to break into bird feeders pretty easily and get all the food out of them. I have squirrels that come visiting to my back deck just about every day, and they are always looking for peanuts because I'll throw out a few peanuts for them. Sometimes the squirrels win. Sometimes the scrub jays get there before the squirrels do, because scrub jays, as it turns out, they really like peanuts almost as much as squirrels do. So sometimes they don't really have arguments about it because they think the scrub jays are so clever that they just come in, like the squirrel runs off with his peanut, the scrub jays come in and go, quick, grab all the rest of them. And then they grab a whole bunch, then they fly off, then the squirrel comes back and he's like, what happened to all the peanuts? They're gone. So it's kind of interesting how wildlife works here in the city. So that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be looking at lots of other animals as the weeks go on, because there really are a lot of wildlife here in San Francisco, which is interesting when you think about the fact that this is a city and we don't think of it as teeming with wildlife, but it really is. So let's get started, shall we? So let's look at our different varieties of North American squirrels. This one that you see here is actually one that's native to the West Coast. It's called the Western gray squirrel. You can kind of see why. He looks pretty gray. Then I think mostly on the East Coast, we have red squirrels. And that's this little guy. Notice, I don't know if you would pay much attention to this, but notice how it doesn't have a super bushy tail like the ones that we typically see around here. I think a little bit smaller, awfully cute. Then we also have the fox squirrel, and this is also a pretty cute little guy, more yellow in front, very bushy tail in the back. He's also pretty interesting. I'm not quite sure where his main area is that he hangs out in. And we also have the black squirrel. This one I find really interesting because I have never seen a black squirrel. I'm not sure what part of North America it lives in, but it's a pretty cool looking squirrel, you have to admit. Now, the one that you guys are probably more likely to see is the eastern gray squirrel. Notice how fat that tail is. Much fatter than our western gray squirrel's tail, and much fatter than the red squirrel we saw before. This little guy has become somewhat invasive. He's gone into areas of North America where there aren't other squirrels, and the result of that is that he's sort of taken over, or she, depending on the squirrel. So, what do we know about squirrels? They're pretty smart. They're extremely agile. They can figure things out pretty darn well when it comes to getting around in trees, jumping. If they have to go from here to there, they can usually get distances that you wouldn't think an animal could do. They're very smart, bright little creatures. What else do they like to do? Can you guys think of anything that you ever see squirrels with? Or if you're out in the park, if a squirrel walks up to you, what does he usually want? He wants nuts. Squirrels like nuts a lot. It's one of their favorite things. Just about anything. Walnuts, filberts, peanuts. Squirrels around me really like peanuts. And what else do they like? As far as I know, that's really a big thing for them. Now, I'm pretty certain this is another red squirrel. Kind of looks like it to me. Very cool looking. There are actually other types of really interesting looking squirrels in other parts of the world. And one of them is the Indian giant squirrel. Isn't that the coolest looking animal you ever saw? He has this hugely long tail, which I can't really show you very well. You can kind of see the end of it, but you don't see just how long it is in relationship to his body. But there are lots of animals that are in the squirrel family, like groundhogs, for example. Flying squirrels that really can fly, usually at night. Prairie dogs, they're pretty cool. And chipmunks. All kinds of funny little creatures, and they all kind of look like squirrels, don't they? But that's because they're related. They're related to squirrels. They're like their cousins. So what do we know about squirrels? Well, I think some of you might know that they like nuts. The squirrels around my house really like peanuts, but they love walnuts, almonds, filberts, I think you call them hazelnuts, just about anything that's a nut, they're going to like. But if they need to, they'll eat insects and sometimes even other types of very small animals. Not very often, usually only when they're really hungry. They can live to be 5 to 10 years in the wild, but if they're in captivity, they can actually live from 10 to 20 years. The biggest cause of death with a lot of squirrels is when a nest falls from the tree, because at least with tree squirrels, which is what we're talking about today, they've got nests up in the tree, and sometimes those guys fall out, and if they do, a lot of times they don't make it. Another interesting aspect about squirrels is that tail of theirs. They have this hugely long tail, and how does that work for them? Why do they need to have such a big tail? Well, they can use it to keep rain or wind or cold away from itself. They can cool themselves off by just pumping more blood through its tail. It also works really well as a way to balance themselves when they're jumping around in trees. So it's kind of like a counterbalance, and it really works for them. Another thing it can do is when they're jumping, they use it almost like a parachute, which is another really interesting thing. And they also use it to signal with, and I've actually noticed that myself with the squirrels that I've watched that are around my house. They flick their tails in this certain way, and I always have the impression they are signaling to another squirrel who is almost invariably close by. So one thing I thought I would show you is just some of the fairy squirrels that I see around my deck. Here's one right here. Now, if you were looking at some of those photographs earlier, you might recognize that this does not look like a western gray squirrel to me, because the tail is much bigger and thicker. I think it's an eastern gray squirrel, which means it actually is a creature that has probably kind of invaded California. So here's another thing about squirrels. They have adapted to our urban environment. Guess why? Well, I put out a few extra peanuts for the squirrels. I usually give them a few every day. And they're pretty good at seeing them. Even though they might be all the way over there in that tree, that squirrel went, oh, I see it, and decided to come over. They're very graceful, these guys. Notice, he's looking, he's just about to go, and then what happened? Something made him go away. He says, I'm out of here. Guess why? My goofy dog, Buster, was just hanging there. So the squirrel said, no way, Jose. And of course, my dog was oblivious, finally left, and the squirrel came back. However, squirrels and scrub jays tend to like the same things. And squirrels, as fast as they can be, are not quite as fast as a scrub jay. That little scrub jay, he came, he surveyed the scene. The squirrel's like, hum-de-dum-de-dum. Watch this guy. He goes, he gets it, comes back, gets another one, comes back, gets another one. And they also can work in teams. So they keep going, coming and going and coming and going. And sometimes by the time that squirrel comes back, well, it's kind of too late. Or there's not nearly as many peanuts left as he thought there was going to be. So squirrels sometimes have competitors that have also adapted pretty darn well to the urban environment. They're not the only ones. Now there is something that I would like for you to watch. It's optional, but it is pretty hilarious. And I've attached it to my playlist, and hopefully your teacher will be able to direct you over to it. And it is called the Squirrel Obstacle Course. And it is actually this man who got frustrated because the squirrels in his backyard were eating all the seeds that he was putting out for all the birds. And eventually he built an entire obstacle course, which is really hilarious. But it's not only really funny, it's also fascinating because he discovered in the course of making all these obstacles for the squirrels just how smart they were and how quickly they figured things out, how they could just jump their way and always land on their feet, kind of the way cats do. And they outsmarted him. At the end of the day, they kind of figured it all out. So it's a little bit long. If you want to skip part of it, if you want to kind of skip to the best part, skip about the first 8 minutes, and then it's still going to be about 15 minutes long. But it is not 15 minutes that you'll feel you've wasted in your little lives. You might really think it's funny. And it might teach you a little bit more about squirrels than you ever could have possibly imagined. So, have fun, and I'll see you next time. And look out for squirrels this week.